As he gazes out at the Manhattan cityscape from his apartment, Paul Simon is lost in thought. He has a notebook, a list, and a song whirling around in his head. Not of influences, but of transgressions, a private mental catalog. Paul Simon had a gift for beautiful calm poetry, but he had a zero-tolerance policy for gimmicks, pretense, and haughtiness. He subtly but clearly grew to despise these six musicians. Motivated by profound personal hurts, intellectual disagreements, and collisions of aesthetic vision rather than petty competitiveness. The first man's name was the titan he had previously looked up to, but who now despises Bob Dylan. It started with a heavy heart. Prior to their meeting, Simon and many of his contemporaries in the 1960s held Dylan in high esteem. Dylan possessed an irresistible allure with his enigmatic presence, his lyrical abstractions, and his almost indestructible spirit. Once upon a time, Paul had studied his songs like scripture. Nevertheless, the magic was broken when their paths eventually collided. As a result of Dylan's coldness and hardly disguised contempt for Simon's music, Paul felt more invisible and unappreciated than he had at any previous gathering of musicians. How ingenious! At one occasion, Simon overheard Dylan mutter something. Words reverberated for several days. There was more to it than that. Erase was the term. Paul felt like an outcast after coming here seeking connection. As time went on, Simon began to view Dylan less as a guide and more as an adversary who flat out ignored his status as an equal. With Simon making fun of Dylan's nasal drawl in interviews, the passive-aggressive jabs became a public game. Dylan acquiring Simon's manuscript. I'm knee-deep in misery. Jabs they weren't. These were cold battles fought in prisons. In his heart, Simon thought Dylan's mystique was all an act, a shadow musician. A buddy of his was once summoned by him. It wasn't because Dylan had let him down, but rather that he had once craved Dylan's acceptance. Therefore, it was the biggest letdown of his creative life. A wound can be left by that type of quiet. If Bob Dylan represented the afterlife of ordinary people, then Lou Reed would be the next logical choice. Snarling alienation from Lou was never Simon's thing. Someone preoccupied with harmony and organization would find the Velvet Underground's rough, ragged edges repugnant. Lou revered dissonance as a philosophy, in contrast to Paul's surgical accuracy while crafting music. It wasn't merely cliché. It was a philosophy. They were completely at odds with one another. Once upon a time, they were label partners, and Simon recalled their encounters as cold affairs. Indoors, Lou would arrive late, sunglasses on, arms folded as if preparing for battle, saying something is horrible. In all honesty, I'm not too impressed. Everyone feels like they're just average, including myself. Simon characterized Lou's confrontational demeanor as lacking substance. His indifference seemed more like an act than a genuine emotion. To Paul's contempt, Reed returned the compliment. Not the good kind of music, he scowled at therapists. On two separate occasions, in low light and with strained civility, their universes clashed. On the second occasion, Lou abruptly ended Paul's sentence and silently left the room. A quarrel did not occur. I felt much worse. Dismissal was the word. For Simon, respect didn't require loudness so much as a stillness that pierced deep. He never forgot or forgave it. Singh was the next person whose flawlessness Simon could not stand. They were frequently paired with other poets of their time and hired for the same festivals. However, every time Sting's name was spoken, a subtle strain lurked beneath Paul's calm exterior. The stage presence, the stage-managed sincerity, and the constant impression that Sting was rehearsing knowledge rather than actually embodying it irritated him. Simon felt that music communicated wounds. It seemed like highly staged, cerebral, and painstakingly choreographed play to Sting. What he really meant was that Sting sings for the applause like he's solving a puzzle. Sting proposed a duet in 2002 at a charity function. He even cracked a joke while performing. Literary duo. One microphone only. An icy grin spread across Paul's face as he grinned. However, he subtly turned down any suggestions of further collaboration the following morning. Later that night, He returned to his hotel and frantically scribbled notes, not for a song, but just to let them all out. He wasn't irritated because of envy. There was a sense of letdown. Sting personified everything that music shouldn't be: regimented, mechanical, and uncaring, in his view. They remained silent thereafter. More than any duet could have said, Paul's silence did. Not all conflicts involved legendary figures. Following that, we have Ed Sheeran, a celebrity whose star climbed too quickly. Hustle was revered by Simon. He was cognizant of the winding paths, the seedy clubs, and the years spent constructing something sincere. What he couldn't stand, though, was imitation passing itself off as respect. According to his previous statement, Ed's early discography resembled Simon and Garfunkel, minus the discomfort. That remark sprang from sadness, not envy. The loss of the music's potential. He initially ignored it. Remember that young people mimic. However, things took a turn when Ed cast Paul as an inspiration and set him on a course. Simon felt a knot in his stomach. He felt unappreciated. Utilized, he felt. He dialed a number. Instructed his staff to prevent themselves from being booked on the same festival circuits by blocking any requests for joint interviews. "I'm not his compass," he whispered secretly. Above all else, he kept to himself. The ascent of Ed, Paul secretly felt, signaled a perilous turning point. A tale devoid of wounds, music devoid of tension. Until it became personal, it was impersonal. Until he felt like an afterthought in the story of another. An ornamental touch, devoid of the bruising that gave his work its authenticity. Then, two competing conceptions of power came crashing down. The goddess Madonna. Boldness, as long as it wasn't fake, had Simon's admiration. He believed that vulnerability, not spectacle, was the bedrock of art. On an off-the-record occasion, he said that Madonna was selling revolt like soda drink, transforming suffering into a commodity and shock into a marketing tactic. Not that he despised celebrity. The effect on truth was something he despised. Rather than progress, he perceived marketing in Madonna's evolution. A stage version of the revolution made safe for television. At a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony, their paths finally collided. It was a very lively room. Light bulbs that emit a flash. Champagne. A continuing legacy. Madonna approached him with an air of self-assurance befitting a person accustomed to lavish attention. A politician's grin adorned her face. Stance perfection, strategic charisma. Paul withheld the vitality. Not interested, but out of politeness, he reached out his hand. The tension between them was palpable, even if their handshake was short. He could see her focus go to the onlookers and cameras in an instant. During her presentation, he felt like an object. There was no fury. It was a chillier substance. Let down. Something fundamental about himself was validated in that moment. Not only his concerns about her. That his brand of genuineness had become an object of veneration in a society that cherished artificiality. Someone else later wanted to know what they had discussed with him. He claimed nothing. The portion that was most forthright was that there was no greater accusation than apathy in Simon's world, and that moment, caught in the glare of fame, signified a silent, everlasting rejection. Two stars, one seeking legacy and the other seeking authenticity. And lastly, the name that inflicted the greatest pain, Art Garfunkel. Prior to their rift, they lived harmoniously as brothers. Their voices harmonized like soaring cathedrals, but behind the surface, there was a web of tension, creative control issues, ego, piercing silence, simmering resentments, and unspoken apologies that weakened their once sacred bond. The damage that Garfunkel's decisions caused to Simon's recollections was something that Simon despised. Rather than bringing joy, each get-together served as a sobering reminder of the trust that had been broken. Garfunkel's quest of solo acclaim at the expense of his presence at crucial periods came across as desertion disguised as ambition. Paul never saw any resemblance between them, even when they were side by side during a return. Interrupted by brief, strained appearances that served merely to exacerbate the wounds, There were extended stretches without communication. Silence greeted the end of a Los Angeles meal. Separate automobiles were the result of a picture shoot in Paris. When Simon witnessed Art smiling on stage, he couldn't help but wonder if it was genuine or if it was simply another mask that Art donned throughout their time apart. Their song had ceased. Surviving was their goal. He longed for the days of harmonizing with the boy he had met in studios and stairwells. He longed for the days when their voices could effortlessly harmonize. However, the darkness of resentment put an end to that inclination. Like any sibling, I loathed him too, Simon confided in a journalist once in an unguarded moment. I loved Art like a brother. However, underneath that animosity was a loss of connection that music could not mend, a pain that was too vast for music to encompass. However, this world was not meant to shield. Though Paul Simon spent his life making music, silence had just as much of an impact on him. The quiet following treachery, the pauses following insults, and the silences between friends. When words failed, Paul turned to music as a means of communication. At times, the most sincere songs he never shared were the ones in which silence composed its own lines. He was aware of the fact that quiet may cut more deeply than sound. On long drives home from nerve-wracking interviews, in the halls of backstage, and in the absence of birthday calls, he had experienced its sting. Silence was sacred to Simon, but sound was sacred to him. The afterlife resided there. Anger and bitterness flourished in those areas. Understated, non-explosive, and pinpoint accurate. Instead of a yell in the pitch black, there was a note omitted, the harmony broken. Rude didn't come blazing in flames. With each phrase encoded in their memories, they settled like dust. Most of these names didn't make it into his songs, but he recalled them in a left-out line, a steely tune, and the breath he skipped between verses. With each omission and deliberate silence, there was a subtle statement being made. For some reasons, brilliance is more like a hum than a scream. It allows the fury to reverberate across chords. Absence is allowed to talk. Paul Simon was also humming the entire time. Never once did he need to sing loudly. He was bright, quiet, and had a memory like a chorus. His reserved demeanor was not a sign of weakness. Accuracy was key. Poems devoid of punctuation were presented.